Listen carefully because this is where most people get it wrong. They see distance, they feel the silence, and they assume it means disinterest. But that's not always truth. Sometimes distance is not rejection, it's protection. And when you're dealing with someone who has built their identity around avoiding emotional overwhelm, every step toward you is not casual, it's courageous. Now here's the sign you must not ignore. They come back, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. You see, anyone can show up when it's easy. Anyone can be present when emotions are light, when connection feels safe, when there's no risk of exposure. But the person who pulls away because they're overwhelmed and then chooses to return, that's a different story. That's a silent battle you don't see. That's someone fighting their own wiring just to reconnect with you. And you have to understand what that means. It means you matter, because people don't return to what is irrelevant. They don't circle back to what they feel nothing for. Avoidant individuals especially are wired to escape discomfort. So when they feel intensity, their instinct is to create distance. That's their shield. That's their survival mechanism. But when they come back, they are overriding that instinct. They are stepping back into something that challenges them. That is not weakness, that is effort. But here's where your awareness becomes power. You cannot measure their love by consistency alone, you must measure it by intention and return. Because for them, consistency is the mountain they're still learning to climb. But the fact that they keep coming back to you, that's them choosing you again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. And let me tell you something, people always move toward what they value, even if they take a complicated path to get there. So if they disappear and then reappear, don't just react emotionally. Don't just label it as confusion or mixed signals. Look deeper. Ask yourself, are they coming back with awareness? Are they trying, even in small ways, to reconnect? Because effort doesn't always look loud. Sometimes effort is quiet. Sometimes it's simply the act of not giving up on you. Now, this doesn't mean you tolerate endless cycles without growth. Growth is the standard, but early on, return is the signal. It tells you that despite their fear, despite their internal resistance, they are drawn back to you, and that matters. Because in a world where people walk away at the first sign of discomfort, the one who comes back is revealing something real. They are telling you, without perfect words, this connection is stronger than my fear. But you must meet that with wisdom, not desperation. You must stay grounded in your value, because your role is not to chase them when they run, it's to remain steady so that when they return, they find something safe, something certain, something that doesn't punish their fear, but also doesn't reward inconsistency. That's strength. And understand this, every time they come back and you respond with calm, clarity, and emotional stability, you are teaching them a new experience of connection. You are showing them that closeness doesn't have to equal chaos. That intimacy doesn't have to mean losing control. You become the evidence that rewires their belief. So don't just look at the distance, look at the return. Because return is intention. Return is effort. Return is the beginning of transformation. And if they keep choosing to come back to you despite everything inside them telling them to run, then you are not chasing something one-sided, you are standing in something that is slowly, quietly becoming real. Pay attention to the pattern, not just the moment. Anyone can walk away when things feel intense, that's easy. But what matters is what happens next. Do they come back? Not out of convenience, not because they're bored, but because something inside them keeps pulling them toward you. That return is not random. It's a signal. It's a reflection of an internal conflict where their fear tells them to create distance, but their feelings refuse to let them stay away. You have to understand how significant that is. For someone who is wired to avoid emotional closeness, stepping back into connection feels like stepping into the unknown. It challenges their sense of control. It forces them to confront emotions they've spent years learning to suppress or escape. So when they come back, they're not just showing up casually, they're pushing against their own conditioning. Most people misread this cycle. They see the withdrawal and label it as disinterest. They feel the silence and assume it means the connection isn't real. But if that were true, there would be no return. Indifference doesn't circle back. A lack of care doesn't re-engage. When someone consistently finds their way back to you, it means there is something unresolved, something meaningful, something they are not ready to lose. But here's where your clarity must be stronger than your emotion. You cannot just focus on the fact that they come back, you must observe how they come back. Is there effort? Is there a shift, even a small one, in how they engage with you? Because returning alone is a sign, but returning with awareness is growth. And growth is what determines whether this connection has direction or is simply repeating itself. You are not there to reward inconsistency, but you are there to recognize intention. There is a difference. Intention shows up in the way they try to reconnect, even if they don't do it perfectly. Maybe they reach out in a way that feels hesitant. Maybe they don't have the right words, but still make an effort to reestablish contact. That matters. Because for them, even small steps require emotional risk. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore your own standards. Your presence must remain grounded, not reactive. If you chase every time they pull away, you reinforce their pattern. If you become unstable in response to their distance, you add pressure to something they already struggle to manage. But when you stay centered, when you allow them the space they take without losing your sense of self, you create an environment where their return becomes safer, not heavier. And safety is everything for someone who avoids emotional intensity. When they come back and find calm instead of chaos, clarity instead of confusion, they begin to associate connection with stability rather than overwhelm. That's how patterns slowly begin to shift. Not through force, not through pressure, but through consistent emotional grounding. But you must also be honest with yourself. Are they coming back because they genuinely value the connection, or are they coming back because it's comfortable? There's a difference. Value leads to gradual change. Comfort leads to repetition without growth. Your awareness of that difference is what protects your energy. Because while their return is a powerful sign, it is not the final destination. It is the beginning of a process. A process where fear and connection are in constant tension, and each return is a step towards something deeper, if handled with patience and strength. So don't reduce their actions to simple labels. Look at the pattern. Look at the intention behind the return. Because when someone repeatedly comes back to you despite their instinct to pull away, they may be trying to tell you something. It means you are not just an option in their life, you are a pull they cannot easily ignore. Look beyond grand gestures, because with someone who avoids emotional exposure, transformation rarely arrives in dramatic moments. It shows up quietly in fragments and pieces so small you could miss them if you're only looking for obvious proof. The real signal is not in what they declare, it's in what they slowly reveal. Vulnerability for them is not a natural state. It's something they've learned to guard, to filter, to keep under control. So when it begins to appear, even in the slightest form that is not casual, it is intentional. You might notice it in the way they start sharing a little more about their day, not just surface details, but something that hints at how they felt. You might catch it in a moment where they admit stress instead of masking it, or when they open up about something that made them uncomfortable. These are not big confessions, not deep emotional monologues, but they are cracks in the wall they've spent years building. And those cracks matter, because vulnerability is not an all-or-nothing experience, especially for someone who has learned to associate it with risk. It is a gradual process, a series of tests where they reveal just enough to see how it will be received. They are watching, consciously or not, for your reaction. Are you safe? Are you stable? Will you judge, push, or overwhelm them with more than they are ready to give? Every small moment of openness is followed by an internal evaluation, and your response determines whether they take another step forward or retreat again. This is where most people fail the test without even realizing it. They demand more too quickly. They take a small opening and try to turn it into a deep emotional conversation. They interpret a moment of sharing as a signal that the other person is now ready for full transparency. And in doing so, they apply pressure to something that is still fragile. That pressure doesn't accelerate growth, it shuts it down. Because for someone who fears emotional intensity, being pushed beyond their pace doesn't feel like love, it feels like loss of control. So your role is not to extract vulnerability, it is to allow it. To create an environment where it can exist, without being forced into something bigger than it is. When they share something small, you meet it with calm, not interrogation. When they open a little, you acknowledge it without turning it into a moment that feels heavy or overwhelming. You let it breathe. And what happens over time is powerful. Those small moments begin to stack. What started as occasional, surface-level sharing becomes slightly deeper. What once felt difficult begins to feel more familiar. And slowly, without dramatic announcements, they start to trust the space between you. Not because you demanded it, but because you proved that their vulnerability would not be mishandled. That's how real progress looks. It's not loud. It's not immediate. It's subtle, but it's consistent. But again, awareness is everything. You must distinguish between genuine vulnerability and performative openness. Genuine vulnerability feels hesitant, imperfect, sometimes even awkward. It doesn't come out polished or structured. It comes out real. Performative openness, on the other hand, often lacks depth or follow-through. It may sound good in the moment, but it doesn't evolve. You're looking for progression, not perfection. Because when someone who is naturally guarded begins to show even small pieces of their inner world, it means they are starting to trust not just you, but the experience of being seen. And that is not something they give easily. So don't underestimate the small moments. Don't overlook the subtle shifts. Because in this kind of dynamic, the quiet signs are the loudest truths. Watch what they do when no one is forcing them, when there's no pressure, no expectation hanging over the moment. Because words are easy, words can be shaped, adjusted, even used as a shield. But actions reveal alignment. Actions expose truth. And with someone who has a pattern of avoidance, this alignment doesn't happen instantly, it develops slowly, unevenly, but meaningfully over time. At first there may be a gap. They say they care, but their behavior feels inconsistent. They express interest, but then disappear. They promise connection, but struggle to sustain it. And if you only look at that early stage, you might think the words mean nothing. But the real question is not whether there's a gap, it's whether that gap is closing. Because growth is not about perfection from the beginning. It's about direction. So you start observing differently. You stop asking, are they perfect, and start asking, are they improving? Are they following through a little more than before? Are they becoming slightly more reliable in how they show up? Do their actions begin to echo their intentions, even if it's not consistent yet? That shift, no matter how small, is where the truth lives. Maybe in the beginning they would say they'll call and then disappear for days. But over time you notice they miss fewer of those moments. Maybe they still struggle, but now they acknowledge it. Maybe they don't always get it right, but they try to repair it when they don't. That matters, because effort that leads to adjustment is different from empty repetition. And here's the deeper layer: alignment is not just about what they do, it's about when they do it. Do they show up even when it's inconvenient? Do they reach out even when they feel the urge to withdraw? Because that's where real change happens. Not when it's easy, but when it challenges their default pattern. When someone who tends to avoid closeness begins to act in ways that require presence, consistency, and accountability, they are stepping outside of their comfort zone. And that is never accidental. That is a choice being made again and again, often without recognition, often without applause. But you have to stay grounded in your standards. Growth does not mean you ignore inconsistency, it means you measure it differently. You're not excusing behavior that hurts you, but you are aware of whether that behavior is shifting. Because there's a difference between someone who repeats the same cycle endlessly and someone who is slowly breaking it. One is stuck, the other is evolving, and your role is not to rush that evolution, but to recognize it accurately. Because if you expect immediate alignment, you will miss the progress. And if you ignore progress, you might walk away from something that is genuinely transforming. At the same time, you don't abandon yourself in the process. You don't lower your value or accept less than you deserve. You simply stay aware. You stay clear. You stay rooted in what is real, not just what is promised. Because when actions begin to match words, even gradually, it builds something powerful: trust. Not blind trust, not forced trust, but earned trust. The kind that develops through repeated evidence, through small moments of reliability, through consistent attempts to do better. And for someone who has struggled with emotional consistency, that alignment is not just a sign of care, it's a sign of effort, intention, and internal change. So don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. Watch how it evolves. Because when words and actions begin to move in the same direction, even if it's slow, it means something real is taking shape beneath the surface. Watch how they handle space, because for someone who is naturally guarded, space is not just physical, it's emotional territory. It's where they feel control, where they regulate themselves, where they retreat to when things start to feel too intense. So when they begin to let you into that space, even in small ways, it is not casual. It is deliberate. It is a shift in how they experience safety. At first, access may be limited. You might only see certain sides of them, certain moods, certain moments they feel comfortable sharing. Their world feels structured, contained, almost like there are invisible boundaries you can't cross. And that's because those boundaries have been protecting them for a long time. They're not there to keep you out personally, they're there to keep them in control emotionally. But then something starts to change. You notice they invite you into more of their life. Maybe they start sharing details about their routine, their environment, the things they care about. Maybe they let you see them in moments that aren't perfectly composed, when they're tired, distracted, or not at their best. These may seem like ordinary things, but for someone who is used to maintaining distance, they are meaningful shifts, because letting you into their space means they are allowing you to see more of their reality. And that takes trust. It's not just about physical presence, like spending more time together or inviting you into their personal environment. It's about emotional access. Do they begin to include you in their thoughts? Do they reference you when making plans? Do they start to consider you as part of their world, rather than someone who exists outside of it? These are the quiet indicators that the boundary is softening. But here's where awareness becomes essential. You cannot force your way into that space. You cannot demand access before they are ready, because the moment it feels like intrusion, they will retreat. For them, control over their space is deeply tied to their sense of security. So when you respect that space instead of pushing against it, you create an environment where they can open it willingly. And willingness is everything. When they choose to let you in, it means they are no longer just protecting themselves, they are beginning to share themselves. That's a transition from defense to connection. It's subtle, but it's powerful. You might notice they linger longer in conversations instead of cutting them short. You might see them initiate time together instead of always responding to you. You might feel a shift where their presence becomes more relaxed, less guarded, less calculated. These are signs that your presence is no longer something they need to manage carefully, it's something they are starting to feel comfortable with. And comfort, for someone who avoids emotional intensity, is not easily given. But again, this is not about perfection. They may still need space at times. They may still pull back when things feel overwhelming. That doesn't erase the progress, it simply means they are still navigating their internal limits. What matters is whether the overall pattern is expanding, whether the door is opening wider over time. Because real connection is not built by breaking down someone's walls, it's built by creating enough safety that they choose to lower them themselves. And when they do, even gradually, it changes the dynamic. You're no longer standing outside trying to understand them, you're being invited inside piece by piece. So don't overlook those moments. Don't dismiss them because they seem small. Because in this kind of connection, access is earned slowly, and every step they take toward letting you into their space is a reflection of growing trust, growing comfort, and a quiet but meaningful shift towards something deeper. Understand this clearly: pressure and emotional safety cannot exist in the same space for someone who is avoidant. The moment something starts to feel forced, rushed, or emotionally heavy in a demanding way, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as love, it interprets it as threat. And when something feels like a threat, their natural response is withdrawal. Not because they don't care, but because they are trying to regulate themselves. So one of the most powerful signs you should pay attention to is how they respond when you are not pushing them. Do they soften when the environment feels calm? Do they re-engage when expectations are lowered? Do they come closer when they don't feel cornered emotionally? Because if the answer is yes, you are not dealing with absence of feeling, you are dealing with sensitivity to pressure. And that distinction changes everything. A person who responds to emotional safety is showing you something very important. Their connection to you is real enough to exist when fear is not in control. But it also means that fear is still part of their internal system. So your approach cannot be about forcing clarity or demanding consistency on your timeline. That approach only triggers resistance. Instead, you observe something deeper. You observe whether your presence is becoming a place of calm for them or a source of emotional overwhelm. Because with avoidant patterns, the environment you create often determines their behavior more than your words ever will. When emotional safety is present, something subtle happens. They begin to stay longer in conversations instead of escaping quickly. They become more responsive without needing long gaps. They may not express everything perfectly, but they don't disappear as easily. There is a sense of ease, even if it's small, even if it's inconsistent at first. But when pressure enters, when expectations are expressed in a way that feels heavy or urgent, they start to retreat. Not always immediately, but gradually. First emotionally, then physically. They become less available, less expressive, more distant. And that withdrawal is not random. It is their way of restoring internal balance. So your awareness must shift from chasing behavior to understanding triggers. Because if emotional safety is what draws them closer, then pressure is what pushes them away. And that means your role is not to control their behavior, but to regulate the emotional environment between you. This does not mean you suppress your needs or ignore your boundaries. It means you express them in a way that is grounded rather than reactive. There is a difference between saying, "I need consistency to feel secure," and saying it in a way that carries urgency, fear, or emotional intensity that feels like demand. One creates clarity, the other creates pressure, and how they respond will tell you everything. Do they lean in when you are calm? Do they open up more when you are steady instead of reactive? Do they return more easily when they don't feel emotionally chased? These responses are not accidents, they are signals of how their internal system interacts with safety. Over time, if emotional safety is consistent, something begins to shift in them. They start to associate connection not with pressure, but with stability. And that association is the beginning of change. Because avoidant behavior is not just about avoiding people, it's about avoiding emotional overwhelm. When that overwhelm is no longer present in the same way, the need to escape begins to reduce. But this process requires patience, not pursuit. It requires awareness, not urgency. Because every time pressure replaces safety, the system resets. And every time safety is restored, even briefly, it creates a small opening for trust to grow. So the real sign you are looking for is not perfection. It is responsiveness to emotional safety. It is the difference between someone who disappears under pressure and someone who returns when things feel calm again. And that tells you something essential. The connection is not built on control, it is built on how safe it feels to stay. Pay close attention to progression, because with someone who has avoidant patterns, change is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive as a sudden transformation or a complete shift in personality. It arrives in layers, in small adjustments, in repeated choices that slowly begin to move in a different direction. If you expect perfection, you will miss the entire story unfolding in front of you. Progress is the real signal, not intensity, not promises, not emotional highs, lows. Progress means there is movement away from old patterns, even if that movement is inconsistent. It means that what used to be automatic, like withdrawing completely, shutting down communication, or disappearing under emotional weight, starts to soften over time. Not disappear instantly, but soften. You may notice they don't vanish for as long as they used to. You may notice they return more often after pulling away. You may notice that when they feel overwhelmed, instead of completely cutting off, they leave a trace of connection behind. These are not random changes. They are indicators that something inside them is beginning to shift in how they relate to closeness. And you must learn to read those shifts correctly. Because most people either expect too much too fast or give up too early. They see inconsistency and assume nothing is changing. But inconsistency is often part of the process. Emotional rewiring is not linear. It does not move in a straight line upward. It moves forward, then pauses, then sometimes steps back, and then moves forward again. But the direction is what matters. Are they, over time, becoming slightly more present? Are they repairing moments of distance more often than before? Are they showing more awareness of how their behavior affects the connection? These are subtle but powerful signs that something is evolving. And evolution requires repetition. One good moment is not progress. One apology is not progress. One emotional opening is not. Progress is what happens when those moments begin to repeat and slowly become more natural, less forced. It is when effort starts to replace avoidance in specific situations, even if not in all situations yet. At the same time, you must remain grounded in reality. Progress does not mean you ignore your own emotional needs. It does not mean you tolerate cycles without reflection. It means you observe whether the pattern is changing or staying the same. Because if the cycle repeats endlessly without improvement, that is not progress, that is stagnation. But if you see even small shifts, slightly more communication, slightly more accountability, then you'll see a difference. Slightly more willingness to re-engage after distance, then you are witnessing movement. And movement matters because it shows capacity for change. With avoidant dynamics, the biggest mistake is assuming that absence of perfection equals absence of growth. That is not true. Growth often looks messy in the beginning. It looks like hesitation mixed with effort. It looks like progress followed by retreat, then return again. But underneath that pattern, something important may be happening. Their comfort with connection is slowly expanding. And your role is not to accelerate that process, but to recognize it honestly. Because when you acknowledge progress instead of dismissing it, you stay aligned with reality. And when you stay aligned with reality, you make clearer decisions about what you are experiencing, not what you hope for or fear. But if you ignore progress entirely, you risk missing real change. And if you overvalue small changes as final outcomes, you risk settling too early. So balance is everything. You are looking for direction, not perfection. You are looking for evidence that the old pattern is weakening and a new pattern is forming, even if it is still fragile. And when you see that direction consistently pointing toward more openness, more engagement, more responsibility, even in small increments, that is your answer. That is the sign that what you are experiencing is not static. It is becoming something more stable, one step at a time. Thank you for being here and investing your energy in this journey of growth and understanding. Goodbye, and may you move forward with clarity, strength, and deeper awareness in every connection you choose.